In October 1984, British customs officers boarded a freighter called the Merida Ann off the coast of Kerry, Ireland. Below deck, they found 7 tons of weapons, rifles, handguns, grenades, bound for the provisional IRA. It was one of the largest single-arm seizures in the history of the Troubles. But the Merida Ann was only one shipment. Behind it was a funding and logistics apparatus that had been generating millions of dollars every single year, not just from sympathetic donors, but from fuel fraud, counterfeit goods, taxi rackets, and a transatlantic arms pipeline stretching from Boston to Belfast. To understand how it all fell apart, you need to understand how it was built, layer by layer, continent by continent, over more than a decade. This is the operational anatomy of the IRA's financial machine. The Provisional IRA formed in December 1969 as a splinter from the original IRA, following sectarian violence in Belfast and Derry. From day one, its leadership understood a fundamental problem. Ideology alone does not buy weapons, safe houses, or operatives. They needed money. Consistent, large-scale, deniable money. Their first answer was the diaspora. Roughly 40 million Americans claimed Irish descent, and among them was a deep well of romantic sympathy for Irish republicanism, particularly in Boston, New York, and Chicago. The IRA moved quickly to tap it. In 1970, NORAID, the Irish Northern Aid Committee, was established in New York. Officially, it collected funds for the families of Republican prisoners. Unofficially, U.S. federal investigators would later allege that a significant portion of those funds moved directly to the IRA's Army Council. But there was a problem that nobody talked about openly. Donations alone could not sustain a military campaign. The IRA needed weapons at scale, not cash for funerals. And donations, however generous, were traceable. What the IRA's leadership wanted was a self-funding infrastructure that could operate below the radar of both the FBI and British intelligence. What happened next would take years to fully understand. The answer came from Boston. Through the 1970s, a network of Irish-American Republicans with deep community ties began quietly acquiring firearms, legally purchased in bulk across multiple states, and preparing them for transatlantic shipment. The operation's key architect was a former U.S. Army veteran and committed Republican named George Harrison. Harrison's network operated for nearly a decade before investigators caught on. The method was methodical. Buy legally from licensed dealers, avoid patterns, use multiple identities, and route the weapons through a chain of intermediaries before they ever reached a port. But the real genius wasn't in the purchasing. It was in how they got the guns across the Atlantic. The weapons were disassembled, stripped of identifying marks, and packed inside innocuous freight, furniture crates, machinery boxes, bales of commercial goods. They moved through Boston's commercial shipping infrastructure, mixed among thousands of legitimate containers crossing the Atlantic every week. On the Irish end, trusted contacts received the shipments at rural landing points, small fishing harbors, isolated farms near the coast. The weapons were then broken into smaller caches and moved inland through a network of safe houses, never concentrated long enough to present a single target. Between 1970 and 1981, Harrison's network is estimated to have shipped over 100 handguns, scores of rifles, and hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition to the IRA. But this was only one arm of the operation, and there was one detail that nobody on the outside had noticed yet. While Boston fed the weapons pipeline, the IRA was building parallel revenue streams inside Ireland and Britain itself. The most lucrative was fuel laundering, a system so elegantly structured that it would eventually generate tens of millions of pounds over its operational lifespan. Here is how the fuel scheme worked. In Ireland, agricultural diesel, red diesel, was sold tax-free for farm use. Road-use diesel carried a heavy excise tax. IRA-linked operators purchased red diesel in bulk at the cheap rate. then used chemical processes to strip the identifying red dye, producing laundered fuel sold at road diesel prices. The profit margin on every liter was pure tax arbitrage. The laundering plants were hidden in farm buildings across the border counties: Armagh, Fermanagh, South Tyrone. Proximity to the Irish Republic Northern Ireland border was essential. It allowed operators to buy in one jurisdiction and sell in another, exploiting the gap in excise regimes between Dublin and London. By the 1990s, fuel laundering operations linked to Republican paramilitaries were generating an estimated 20 to 30 million pounds annually across Northern Ireland and the border region. HMRC investigators later described it as industrial-scale tax fraud with a paramilitary dividend. But the IRA was not relying on fuel alone. Running parallel was a counterfeit goods operation. IRA-linked distributors imported fake cigarettes and counterfeit branded goods, clothing, electronics, DVDs from supply chains in Asia and Eastern Europe. The product moved through the same community networks that had served the movement for decades: trusted shopkeepers, market stalls, informal distributors. Counterfeit cigarettes alone represented a massive margin. Genuine cigarettes carried heavy UK and Irish excise duties, while counterfeit product had near zero cost of goods. Investigators estimated that by the late 1990s, Republican-linked networks controlled a significant share of the Northern Ireland counterfeit tobacco market, worth tens of millions annually. There was one more revenue stream that investigators consistently underestimated: taxi companies. In Republican communities across Belfast and Derry, IRA-linked operators controlled significant shares of the black cab and private hire market. The model was elegant, legitimate on the surface, cash-heavy in practice, and deeply embedded in communities where questions were not asked. Taxi firms served a dual function. They generated legitimate-appearing cash revenue that could absorb funds from other streams, what financial investigators would call layering in money laundering terminology. They also provided a legitimate reason for vehicles, cash, and communication infrastructure to exist without arousing immediate suspicion. By the early 1990s, the IRA's funding infrastructure had become what intelligence analysts called a diversified portfolio of criminal and quasi-legitimate enterprises. No single stream could be shut down without the others continuing. And the Boston connection was about to deliver something far bigger than it ever had before. In the mid-1980s, with the Harrison network compromised and facing FBI scrutiny, the IRA's External Operations Unit, known as GHQ, began cultivating a new and far more ambitious procurement channel. This time, the source was not American gun shops. It was Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Between 1985 and 1987, 4 major shipments from Libya reached the IRA, the largest transfer of weapons to any non-state actor in Western European history. The final shipment, intercepted aboard the Exund in 1987, contained 150 tons of weapons, including ground-to-air missiles, heavy machine guns, and over 2 tons of Semtex explosive. The earlier 3 Libyan shipments, the Casamara, the Villa, and the Kula, had gotten through undetected. They delivered an estimated 120 tons of weapons into IRA hands, representing the most significant single military uplift in the organization's history. What the IRA did not know was that the 4th ship would blow the entire operation wide open. The operational budget required to sustain all of this, the procurement networks, safe houses, active service units, legal defense funds, prisoner support, and propaganda operations, has been estimated by multiple security services at between 5 and 10 million pounds per year through the 1980s and 1990s. The IRA was, by any operational definition, a well-capitalized insurgency. The money was managed through a system of compartmentalization. Local units received operational budgets through intermediaries. Financial controllers operated independently from military commanders, No single individual held a full picture of the organization's finances. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate security architecture designed to limit exposure during interrogations. But no system is perfect, and the first major crack appeared not in Ireland or Boston, but in a courtroom in New York City. In 1982, the FBI dismantled the Harrison network after a 2-year sting operation. Harrison and his associate Flannery were arrested, tried, and acquitted. But the network was blown. What replaced it would become even harder to track. Harrison's acquittal was a legal victory, but an operational catastrophe. The FBI now had detailed knowledge of the smuggling methodology. Ports were watched more carefully. Informants were cultivated more aggressively, and a new joint task force, the FBI, British intelligence MI5, and the PSNI Special Branch, began sharing intelligence in ways they never had before. The Exond interception in November 1987 was the result of exactly this intelligence sharing. French customs, acting on a tip routed through British intelligence, boarded the vessel in the Bay of Biscay. What they found ended the Libyan supply line permanently. But there was something else on that ship that changed everything about how investigators understood the IRA's reach. The Exon's manifest and communications pointed investigators toward the full scope of the earlier 3 successful Libyan shipments. The weapons were already inside Ireland, hidden in an estimated 50 to 80 underground bunkers across the Republic. It was the first time security services had fully grasped the scale of what had already gotten through. On the financial side, the unraveling came more slowly, but it was no less decisive. Throughout the 1990s, an HMRC and PSNI joint unit called the Paramilitary Finance Investigation Unit began systematically mapping the fuel laundering networks. They followed tanker movements, tracked chemical purchases, and placed informants inside distribution chains. The fuel laundering investigations produced a cascade of prosecutions through the late 1990s and early 2000s. Processing plants were raided and demolished. Tens of millions of pounds in laundering equipment was seized and destroyed. But investigators were always working against a moving target. When one plant was shut, another opened within weeks. The political landscape shifted dramatically on August 31, 1994, when the IRA announced its first ceasefire. The Good Friday Agreement followed in 1998, but the criminal infrastructure did not disappear with the politics. In many cases, it accelerated, now serving private enrichment rather than a military campaign. This detail would haunt the peace process for years. The 2004 Northern Bank robbery, in which £40 million was stolen from the bank's Belfast headquarters, was attributed by the IMC, the Independent Monitoring Commission, to the Provisional IRA. It came 6 years after the Good Friday Agreement. The operation was executed with military planning precision, using inside information and sophisticated counter-surveillance. In Washington, the Northern Bank robbery effectively ended NORAD's political cover in the United States. Congressional supporters of Sinn Féin distanced themselves publicly. The Bush administration, post 9/11, already hostile to any organization with a track record of bombings and financing, placed further pressure on the IRA's American network. The diaspora funding model had reached its political limits. The formal decommissioning of IRA weapons occurred in September 2005 under the supervision of General John de Chaslain's Independent International Commission on Decommissioning. Weapons from the Libyan shipments, cached for nearly 20 years, were among those put beyond use. It was the symbolic end of the military supply chain that had begun in Boston in 1970. The financial networks proved far harder to decommission than the weapons. HMRC and PSNI investigators continued targeting fuel laundering operations into the 2010s. By 2015, HM Revenue and Customs estimated that fuel fraud in Northern Ireland, much of it connected to networks with paramilitary origins, still cost the UK Exchequer over £200 million per year. The legacy of the IRA's financial machine is ultimately a lesson in institutional design. The movement built not a single funding source, but an interlocking system of redundant revenue streams, each independently sustainable, each deniable, each deeply embedded in the communities it operated within. When one layer was cut, the others continued. It was resilient by design. For investigators, the IRA's funding model became a foundational case study in countering paramilitary finance, referenced in everything from post-9/11 counterterrorism financing frameworks to EU cross-border excise fraud legislation. Understanding how it worked was ultimately the only way to build systems capable of stopping the next version of it. That's the full operational breakdown of the IRA's transatlantic funding network. If you want to understand how similar systems have been built and dismantled, from cartel finance to state-sponsored smuggling, subscribe to Shadow Ops. Every week, we go inside the logistics of the world's most complex criminal and paramilitary operations.